The laundromat sat on the corner of a street that most people drove past without a second glance. It was the kind of place where the paint peeled off the walls and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were tired of working. Above this small shop was an even smaller apartment, and that's where Elena Vasquez spent the first 18 years of her life. Her mother worked downstairs from 6 in the morning until 10 at night, folding other people's clothes, fixing machines that broke down every other week, and smiling at customers even when her feet ached so badly she could barely stand. Elena's father had left when she was 2 years old. She had no memory of him, just a single photograph her mother kept in a drawer but never talked about. Growing up, Elena learned very quickly that some kids had more than others. Her classmates went on vacations and came back with stories about beaches and theme parks. They had birthday parties with decorations and cakes from fancy bakeries. Elena's birthdays were quiet. Her mother would make rice and beans and maybe buy a small cake from the grocery store if there was extra money that month. Elena never complained. She understood, even as a child, that her mother was doing everything she could, but there was one thing in that laundromat that changed everything for her. It sat in the far corner, covered in dust, and forgotten by almost everyone who walked through the door. An old, upright piano. A customer had left it there years ago, promising to come back for it. He never did. Elena's mother thought about throwing it out 100 times, but it was too heavy to move, and she didn't have the money to pay someone to take it away, so it just sat there, gathering dust and taking up space. Elena was 7 years old the first time she touched those keys. She still remembers that moment like it happened yesterday. It was a rainy afternoon, and the shop was empty. Her mother was in the back, sorting through a pile of sheets and towels. Elena walked over to the piano and pressed one key. Then another. The sound was slightly out of tune, and some of the keys stuck when she pressed them. But something about it felt right. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. From that day on, the piano became her best friend. She didn't have lessons. She didn't have books or teachers or anyone to show her what to do. She just listened. She listened to songs on the radio and tried to copy what she heard. She listened to music playing in stores and restaurants and memorized the melodies in her head. Then she would go back to that old piano and figure out how to make the same sounds with her fingers. It took her months to learn her first real song. She made mistakes constantly. Her fingers hit the wrong notes. Her timing was off. But she didn't stop. Every day after school, while other kids were playing outside or watching television, Elena sat at that piano and practiced. Her mother would watch her sometimes from across the room with a look that was hard to read. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was worry. Maybe it was both. By the time Elena turned 12, something had shifted. She wasn't just copying songs anymore. She was creating her own. Melodies would come to her in the middle of the night, and she would sneak downstairs in her pajamas to play them before she forgot. She wrote music about everything she felt but couldn't say out loud. About missing a father she never knew. About watching her mother work herself to the bone. About feeling invisible in a world that seemed to notice everyone but her. The other kids at school didn't know about the piano. Elena never talked about it. She was the quiet girl who sat in the back of the classroom and never raised her hand. Teachers barely remembered her name. She wasn't bad at school, but she wasn't exceptional either. She just blended into the background like wallpaper. Her music teacher was a man named Mr. Brennan. He was one of those teachers who had probably dreamed of being a professional musician once but ended up teaching at a public school instead. He was kind but tired, the way a lot of teachers get after too many years of budget cuts and overcrowded classrooms. He noticed Elena only because she was so quiet. In a room full of kids talking and laughing and causing trouble, she sat in the corner and said nothing. One afternoon, everything changed. It was a Thursday in late October. School had ended an hour earlier, and the building was nearly empty. Mr. Brennan was walking down the hallway toward the parking lot when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Music. Piano music. Coming from inside one of the classrooms, he followed the sound until he reached the old music room. The door was slightly open. He looked through the gap and saw Elena sitting at the piano inside. Her eyes were closed. Her fingers moved across the keys like they had a mind of their own. She was playing something he didn't recognize, something that wasn't in any book or any lesson plan he had ever seen. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. It was the kind of music that made you forget where you were, and who you were, and what you were supposed to be doing. Mr. Brennan stood there for almost 10 minutes without moving. When Elena finally stopped playing and opened her eyes, she saw him standing in the doorway. Her face went red. She looked like she wanted to disappear. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked into the room and sat down on a chair across from her. Then he asked a simple question. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena looked down at her hands. She told him about the piano in the laundromat, about teaching herself from the radio, about the years of practicing alone with no one listening. Mr. Brennan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told her about the Whitmore Young Artists Competition. It was one of the most prestigious piano competitions in the country. Students came from all over to compete. Most of them had been taking lessons since they were 4 years old. Most of them came from wealthy families who could afford the best teachers and the best instruments. Winning this competition could change a young musician's life forever. Elena shook her head before he even finished talking. She wasn't that kind of person. She didn't belong in places like that. She was just a girl from above, a laundromat who played an old broken piano because she didn't have anything better to do. But Mr. Brennan saw something different. He saw a talent that didn't come from money or training or privilege. It came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere real. 2 weeks later, without telling Elena, he submitted a recording of her playing to the Whitmore competition. He used his phone to record her during one of her after-school sessions. The audio quality was terrible. You could hear the hum of the heating system in the background. But the music was undeniable. When the acceptance letter arrived at Elena's apartment one cold Tuesday morning, she read it 3 times. Then she read it again. The Whitmore competition had invited her to perform. Her, the quiet girl who owned nothing, the girl nobody noticed, the girl everyone had already forgotten. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both. Elena held the letter in her hands for so long that the paper started to wrinkle. She sat on the edge of her bed in that tiny apartment above the laundromat, reading the same words over and over again. The Whitmore Young Artists Competition. They wanted her. They actually wanted her. For a moment, she let herself feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Pure, simple hope. The kind that makes your chest feel warm and your eyes sting with tears you didn't expect. She imagined herself on a real stage, playing a real piano, being seen by people who actually cared about music. It felt like a dream. The kind of dream that poor kids like her weren't supposed to have. Then reality came crashing back. Her mother came home that evening with swollen feet and tired eyes. She had worked a double shift because one of the washing machines broke down again and customers were complaining. Elena showed her the letter without saying anything. She just handed it over and watched her mother's face as she read it. Her mother sat down slowly. She read the letter twice. Then she looked up at Elena with an expression that broke her heart. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't pride. It was fear. The competition was in New York City. That meant bus tickets. That meant a hotel room, even if just for one night. That meant a dress nice enough to wear on a stage where rich kids would be dressed in clothes that cost more than their monthly rent. Her mother did the math in her head without saying a word. Elena could see it in her eyes. The numbers didn't add up. They never did. Her mother put the letter down on the kitchen table. She rubbed her face with both hands, the way she always did when she was trying not to cry. Then, she said the words Elena had been dreading. "We can't afford this, mija. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But we just can't." Elena nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just picked up the letter and went to her room and closed the door behind her. She sat on her bed in the dark for a long time. Not crying. Not moving. Just sitting there with the letter in her lap. She had been foolish to hope. She knew better than that. Girls like her didn't get to chase dreams. They got to survive. That was enough. That had to be enough. The next morning at school, she found Mr. Brennan waiting for her outside the music room. He had a look on his face that she couldn't quite read. Before she could say anything, He told her that he knew about the money problem. He had already thought about it, and he had a plan. Mr. Brennan had called in some favors. A friend of his ran a small charity that helped students attend educational events. They agreed to cover the bus tickets. His wife, who used to work as a seamstress, offered to alter a dress that had been sitting in their closet for years. It wasn't fancy, but it was black and elegant, and it would fit Elena perfectly. As for the hotel, Mr. Brennan said he would drive her there himself and they would figure out the rest. Elena didn't know what to say. She stood there in the hallway with students rushing past her, and she felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. No one had ever done anything like this for her before. No one had ever believed in her enough to fight for her. She said yes. Of course she said yes, but saying yes was the easy part. What came next was harder. Word spread quickly. In a school where gossip traveled faster than homework assignments, everyone soon knew about Elena and the competition. At first, people were just curious. The quiet girl from the laundromat was going to some fancy piano thing in New York. That was interesting. That was different. But curiosity turned into something uglier. It started with whispers. Elena heard them in the hallways between classes. She heard them in the cafeteria. She heard them in the bathroom. When other girls didn't know she was there, they said she was wasting her time. They said she was going to embarrass herself. They said she didn't belong in a place like that, with people like that. One afternoon, a group of kids from her grade cornered her near the lockers. They weren't being cruel exactly. They were just being honest, or at least, that's what they told themselves. One of them looked her up and down and asked a simple question. Do you even own a nice dress? Another one laughed and said something about how she probably learned to play piano from YouTube videos. A third one, a girl who had never spoken to Elena before in her life, shook her head and said what everyone else was thinking. You're going to get up on that stage and everyone is going to see that you don't belong there. Why would you do that to yourself? Elena didn't answer. She just walked away. But the words stayed with her. They echoed in her head every night when she tried to sleep. They followed her to school every morning. They sat beside her like unwelcome guests every time she touched the piano. Even some of the teachers seemed skeptical. She overheard two of them talking in the faculty lounge one day when she was walking past. They didn't say her name, but she knew they were talking about her. One of them mentioned how sweet it was that Mr. Brennan was trying to help, but how it was probably setting the girl up for disappointment. The other one agreed. Some kids just aren't meant for that world, she said. It's sad, but it's true. Elena went home that day and sat in front of the old piano in the laundromat. She placed her fingers on the keys but didn't play. She just sat there, staring at the chipped wood and the yellowed keys that had been her whole world for so many years. She thought about all the hours she had spent teaching herself. All the nights she had stayed up late, practicing until her fingers hurt. All the songs she had written that no one would ever hear. Was it all for nothing? Was everyone right about her? Her mother found her there an hour later. She sat down on the bench beside her daughter and didn't say anything for a long time. They just sat together in the silence, surrounded by the hum of washing machines and the smell of detergent. Finally, her mother spoke. She told Elena about her own mother, Elena's grandmother, who had passed away when Elena was very young. She had been a strong woman, a proud woman. She had worked in factories her whole life and never complained. But she had always told her daughter one thing, over and over again, until it was burned into her memory. The world will try to make you small. It will tell you who you are and who you can never be. But you don't have to listen. You get to decide. Elena's mother took her hand and squeezed it tight. She didn't tell her daughter that everything would be okay. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She just told her the truth. I don't know what's going to happen at that competition. Maybe you'll win. Maybe you won't, but I know one thing for sure. You're not going there to prove anything to those people at school. You're not going there to show anyone that they were wrong about you. You're going there because you love music, and that's the only reason that matters. Elena looked at her mother. She saw the lines on her face from years of hard work. She saw the gray hairs she tried to hide. She saw the woman who had sacrificed everything just to keep them afloat. And in that moment, Elena made a decision. She was going to that competition. She was going to walk onto that stage, and she was going to play like her life depended on it. Not for the judges, not for the other competitors, not for the kids at school who thought she was a joke, for herself, for her mother, for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. 6 weeks. That's how long she had to prepare. 6 weeks to get ready for the biggest moment of her life. She didn't know if it would be enough. She didn't know if anything would ever be enough. But she was going to try. And sometimes, trying is all you can do. 6 weeks sounds like a long time until you realize how fast the days disappear. Elena learned this the hard way. She woke up every morning with a knot in her stomach. Counting down the days until the competition, 42 days became 30, 30 became 20. And with each passing day, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. She practiced every moment she could find. Before school, she would sneak down to the laundromat while it was still dark outside and play for an hour before her mother woke up. After school, she rushed home and practiced until her eyes could barely stay open. She played through dinner. She played through exhaustion. She played until her fingers were so sore that she had to wrap them in bandages just to keep going. The piece she had chosen was one of the most difficult in the classical piano world. It was a piece that professional musicians spent years perfecting. It had fast passages that required fingers to move like lightning. It had soft, delicate moments that needed the kind of control most people never develop. It had emotional depth that couldn't be taught, only felt. When Mr. Brennan heard what she had chosen, he went quiet for a moment. Then he asked her if she was sure. She said yes. She had to play something that would make people pay attention, something that would make them forget where she came from and only hear the music. But as the days went on, doubt started creeping in like water through a cracked ceiling. It started small. A missed note here. A hesitation there. Things she had played perfectly 100 times before suddenly felt impossible. Her hands would freeze above the keys, and she would forget what came next. Her timing would slip, and the whole piece would fall apart. She would stop, take a breath, and start over. Again, and again, and again. She started watching videos online of past winners from the Whitmore competition. She told herself it was research. She told herself it would help her prepare. But all it did was make her feel smaller. These kids were different. You could see it in the way they sat at the piano, like they had been born there. You could see it in their clothes, their perfect posture, their calm and confident faces. They had teachers standing behind them, nodding with approval. They had parents in the audience, recording every moment on expensive cameras. They had everything Elena didn't have. One video in particular stuck with her. It was a boy, maybe 15 or 16 years old, performing at the Whitmore competition 3 years earlier. He played the same piece Elena had chosen, but watching him was like watching magic. His fingers moved so smoothly that it didn't even look real. There was no struggle on his face, no effort, no fear, just pure, effortless beauty. Elena watched that video 7 times. By the end, she felt sick to her stomach. Who was she kidding? She was a girl who had learned piano from an abandoned instrument in a laundromat. She had never had a single lesson in her life. She didn't know the proper techniques. She didn't know the terminology. She didn't know any of the things these other kids had spent their whole lives learning. She was walking into a competition where everyone else had been given a head start she could never catch up to. The cracks in her confidence grew wider with each passing day. She started making mistakes she had never made before. Simple passages that used to flow naturally now tripped her up. Her hands would shake when she sat down to practice. Some nights, she couldn't bring herself to play at all. She would just sit on the bench, staring at the keys, paralyzed by fear. Her mother noticed. Of course she noticed. Mothers always do. She saw the dark circles under Elena's eyes. She saw the way her daughter pushed food around her plate without eating. She heard her crying softly in her room late at night when she thought no one was listening. One evening, About 10 days before the competition, her mother sat down beside her on the piano bench. The laundromat was closed for the night. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Her mother didn't ask if she was okay. She already knew the answer. Instead, she just sat there, quiet and patient, waiting for Elena to speak first. It took a long time. But eventually, the words came pouring out like water from a broken dam. Elena told her mother everything. The videos she had watched, the other competitors with their expensive teachers and their perfect techniques, the mistakes she kept making, the fear that was eating her alive, the voice in her head that told her every single day that she wasn't good enough, that she would never be good enough, that she was foolish for ever thinking she could do this. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Elena finally stopped talking, tears streaming down her face, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Elena would never forget. She told her about a time, many years ago, when Elena's grandmother was still alive. Elena had only been 4 or 5 years old, too young to remember clearly. Her grandmother had been very sick by then, but she still had fire in her eyes. One afternoon, she had called Elena's mother to her bedside and held her hand tightly. She knew she didn't have much time left, and she wanted to leave her daughter with something important. She said that life would always try to convince you that you're not enough, that there will always be someone smarter, richer, more talented, more connected, that the world has a way of making ordinary people feel invisible. But she said that was a lie, the biggest lie there is. She said that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the thing anyway. It's about standing up when everything inside you is screaming to sit down. It's about walking into a room full of people who think you don't belong and showing them that you have just as much right to be there as anyone else. Elena's mother squeezed her hand, the same way her own mother had squeezed hers all those years ago. She looked into her daughter's eyes and said the words that changed everything. You are not going to that competition to win. You are going to that competition to play. That's all. Just play. Play the way you play when no one is watching. Play the way you play when it's just you and the music and nothing else matters. If you can do that, then you've already won. No matter what any judge says. No matter what any scoreboard shows. Elena sat there in the quiet of the laundromat, her mother's words settling into her heart like seeds in soft soil. She thought about all the hours she had spent at this old piano, all the songs she had taught herself, all the music she had created out of nothing but determination and love. Maybe she wasn't like those other kids. Maybe she never would be. But that didn't mean she had nothing to offer. Her music wasn't polished or perfect. It was raw. It was real. It came from a place that fancy training couldn't touch. 3 days later, something almost broke her completely. She was practicing late at night, running through the most difficult section of her piece, when her finger slipped and hit a wrong note. It was a small mistake, barely noticeable, but something inside her snapped. She stopped playing. She sat there in the silence, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She thought about the competition, the stage, the judges, the hundreds of people who would be watching her every move, and for one terrible moment, she wanted to give up. She pulled out her phone and opened her email. She typed a message to the competition organizers. She wrote that she was sorry, that she had made a mistake, that she wouldn't be able to attend after all. Her finger hovered over the send button. One tap, and it would all be over. The fear would go away. The pressure would disappear. She could go back to being invisible, and no one would ever know the difference. But then she heard her grandmother's voice in her head. Not a memory. Exactly. Something deeper. Something that felt like it had always been there, waiting for this exact moment. The world will always give you reasons to stay small. You have to give yourself permission to be big. Elena deleted the email. She closed her phone. She put her hands back on the keys, and she played. The morning of the competition arrived like a thief. Elena woke up before her alarm, her heart already pounding in her chest. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that this was really happening. In a few hours, she would be standing on a stage in New York City. In a few hours, her entire life could change, or she could fail in front of everyone. She pushed that thought away and got out of bed. Mr. Brennan picked them up at 5 in the morning. The drive to New York would take about 3 hours, and they wanted to arrive early. Elena sat in the back seat with her mother, watching the city lights fade into highways and then into open road. No one talked much. There wasn't much to say. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the weeks leading up to this moment. Elena's dress hung in a garment bag beside her. It was simple and black, altered by Mr. Brennan's wife to fit her perfectly. She had tried it on the night before and barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked older somehow, more serious, like someone who was about to do something that mattered. They arrived in New York just after 8 in the morning. The competition wasn't until the evening. But Mr. Brennan wanted Elena to see the venue ahead of time, to get comfortable with the space, to breathe in the air and make it feel less foreign. The concert hall was nothing like Elena had imagined. It was bigger, grander, more intimidating in every possible way. The ceilings stretched up so high that she had to tilt her head back just to see them. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls. The seats were covered in red velvet, row after row after row, enough to hold hundreds of people. And at the front of it all, sitting on the stage like a king on a throne, was the piano, a Steinway Grand. The kind of piano Elena had only ever seen in photographs. It was black and shiny and absolutely perfect. She walked toward it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. When she reached the stage, she stopped and just stared at it. This was the instrument she would play tonight. This was the moment she had been working toward her entire life. She wanted to touch it. She wanted to sit down and play, just to see what it felt like. But she didn't. Not yet. She wasn't ready. The other competitors started arriving in the afternoon. Elena watched them from a quiet corner of the lobby, trying not to stare. They came with entourages, parents in designer clothes, coaches with clipboards and serious expressions. Some of them had photographers following them around, documenting everything like they were celebrities. One girl walked in wearing a gown that probably cost more than Elena's mother made in a month. She had perfect posture and a calm, confident smile. Her mother walked beside her, speaking in French on the phone. Behind them, a man carried a leather bag that probably held sheet music and spare accessories. Elena looked down at her own bag. It was old and worn, the zipper broken on one side. Inside was nothing but her dress and a bottle of water her mother had packed that morning. She felt invisible again, just like she had felt her whole life. The hours passed slowly. Elena tried to eat something, but her stomach was in knots. She tried to rest, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She watched the other competitors warm up on practice pianos in the back rooms. They all looked so calm, so prepared, so certain of themselves. Finally, the competition began. Elena was scheduled to perform last. She didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. On one hand, it gave her more time to prepare. On the other hand, it meant she had to sit through hours of watching everyone else play first. Hours of comparing herself. Hours of feeling smaller and smaller with each passing performance. The competitors were incredible. There was no other word for it. They played with precision and grace, their fingers dancing across the keys like they had been doing this their whole lives. Because they had. These were kids who had started lessons at 3 years old. Kids who had attended the best music schools in the world. Kids who had been groomed for this moment from the day they were born. One boy played a piece so fast and so flawlessly that the audience gasped. A girl performed with such emotion that Elena saw people in the front row wiping tears from their eyes. Each performance was better than the last. Each one raised the bar higher than Elena thought possible. By the time the second-to-last performer finished, Elena felt like she was going to be sick. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth was dry. She couldn't remember a single note of her piece. It was like her brain had been wiped clean by fear. Her mother found her backstage, standing in a corner with her eyes closed. She didn't say anything. She just took Elena's hands in hers and held them tightly. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing together, sharing a silence that said more than words ever could. Then Mr. Brennan appeared at the door. It was time. Elena walked toward the stage on legs that didn't feel like her own. The hallway seemed to stretch forever. She could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain. Hundreds of people waiting to judge her, waiting to see if she belonged. And then she was there, standing at the edge of the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, and the bright lights, and the beautiful piano waiting for her at the center of it all. She walked to the bench and sat down. The audience shifted in their seats. She could feel their eyes on her, curious and skeptical. She was the last performer of the night, the unknown girl with no fancy dress, no entourage, no reputation, just a teenager from a laundromat who had somehow ended up on this stage. She placed her hands on the keys. They were still shaking. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Someone in the audience coughed. A judge shifted in their seat. Elena could feel the doubt filling the room like fog, and then she closed her eyes. She thought about the old piano in the laundromat, the one with the stuck keys and the yellowed ivory. She thought about all the nights she had spent there alone, playing for no one but herself. She thought about her mother working double shifts just to keep them alive. She thought about her grandmother, a woman she barely remembered, who had left behind words that had carried her all the way to this moment. She stopped thinking about the judges. She stopped thinking about the other competitors. She stopped thinking about winning or losing or proving anything to anyone. She just played. The first notes filled the hall like light breaking through clouds. They were soft at first, delicate and searching, like a question being asked in the dark. Then they grew stronger, more confident, building into something that couldn't be ignored. Elena didn't play like the other competitors. She didn't play with perfect technique or textbook precision. She played with something else entirely, something that couldn't be taught in lessons or learned from books. She played with her whole heart. The music poured out of her like it had been trapped inside for years, waiting for this exact moment to break free. It was the sound of loneliness and hope, the sound of struggle and survival, the sound of a girl who had been told her whole life that she wasn't good enough, finally proving to herself that she was. The audience went still, completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. They just listened. A woman in the third row began to cry. She didn't know why. The music just reached inside her and touched something she had forgotten was there. A judge leaned forward in his seat, his pen frozen above his notepad. He had heard thousands of performances in his career. He had never heard anything like this. Elena played for 15 minutes. It felt like 15 seconds. When she struck the final chord, the sound hung in the air like a held breath. The silence lasted for what felt like forever. And then the room exploded. The applause hit her like a wave. It started somewhere in the back of the room and rolled forward, growing louder and louder until it filled every corner of the concert hall. People were standing. Not just a few people. Everyone. Hundreds of strangers rising to their feet, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. Elena sat frozen at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys. She didn't understand what was happening. She had been so lost in the music that she had forgotten where she was. Now reality was rushing back, and it didn't make sense. This kind of reaction was supposed to be for the other competitors. The ones with the fancy teachers and the expensive clothes. Not for her. Never for her. She turned her head slowly and looked out at the audience. The woman in the third row was still crying, pressing a tissue to her eyes. A man near the aisle was shaking his head in disbelief, a smile spreading across his face. The judges sat at their table, and for the first time all night, they weren't writing notes. They were just watching her. Elena stood up from the bench. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. She gave a small bow, the way she had seen other performers do, and walked off the stage in a daze. The applause followed her all the way into the wings. Mr. Brennan was waiting for her backstage. His eyes were red and wet. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into a hug and held her tight. Over his shoulder, Elena saw her mother standing a few feet away. She was crying too, not the quiet, hidden tears she usually cried when she thought no one was watching. These were different. These were tears of joy. Elena walked into her mother's arms and buried her face in her shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim light backstage, while the sound of applause still echoed from the hall. The results wouldn't be announced for another hour. The judges needed time to deliberate. Elena sat in a small waiting room with the other competitors. Trying to avoid eye contact with anyone, she felt strange, empty and full at the same time, like she had given everything she had and there was nothing left inside her. The girl in the expensive gown sat across from her, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. She hadn't looked at Elena once since the performance ended. None of them had. Elena wondered if they even knew her name. When the hour was finally up, everyone was called back into the concert hall for the announcement. The competitors lined up on stage, standing in a row like soldiers waiting for inspection. Elena stood at the very end, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart beating so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. The head judge walked to the microphone. She was an older woman, with silver hair and kind eyes. Elena had read about her online during those weeks of preparation. She was a famous pianist who had performed on stages all over the world. She had won awards that Elena couldn't even pronounce. And now she was standing in front of them, holding an envelope that contained the results. The judge began by thanking everyone for their participation. She talked about how difficult the decision had been. She praised the level of talent on display and said that every competitor should be proud of what they had accomplished. Elena barely heard any of it. She was too busy trying not to pass out. Then the judge paused. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, and a small smile crossed her face. She said something that made Elena's heart stop. In 40 years of this competition, we have never had a unanimous decision. Tonight, that changed. A murmur rippled through the audience. The competitors glanced at each other, confused. Elena didn't move. She didn't breathe. The judge opened the envelope and read the name inside. Elena Vasquez. For a moment, nothing happened. The words hung in the air like they belonged to someone else's story. Then the audience erupted again. Even louder than before. People were cheering, clapping, some of them shouting. Elena felt hands on her shoulders, pushing her forward toward the center of the stage. She walked like she was dreaming, her feet moving on their own. The judge met her at the microphone and handed her a small trophy. It was heavier than Elena expected. She looked down at it, at her name engraved on the brass plate, and still couldn't believe it was real. The judge leaned into the microphone and said something that would stay with Elena for the rest of her life. We hear many technically perfect performances on this stage, musicians who have trained for years and mastered every detail. But tonight, we heard something different. We heard truth. We heard a young woman who didn't just play music. She became it. And that is something no amount of training can teach. Elena looked out at the audience. She found her mother in the crowd, standing near the back with Mr. Brennan. Her mother's face was glowing, proud and tearful and beautiful. In that moment, Elena understood something she had never fully grasped before. This wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. Everyone who had ever believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. The days that followed were a blur. News of her win spread faster than she could have imagined. Local newspapers picked up the story first, then bigger outlets, then national news. The girl from the laundromat who beat the prodigies, the self-taught pianist who won a unanimous decision at one of the most prestigious competitions in the country. It was the kind of story people loved to share. Scholarship offers started arriving within a week. Music schools she had never heard of were suddenly sending her letters, offering full rides, begging her to attend. A famous conservatory in Boston called personally and said they would give her anything she needed: free tuition, free housing, access to the best teachers in the world. A documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to tell her story. A television producer asked if she would be interested in appearing on a morning show. Strangers sent messages on social media, telling her how much her performance had moved them. Some of them shared their own stories of struggle and doubt. They said she had given them hope. Elena read every message. She answered as many as she could, but through all of it, she never forgot where she came from. A few weeks after the competition, she went back to the laundromat. It was late at night, and the shop was closed. She sat down at the old upright piano in the corner, the one with the stuck keys and the chipped wood. She placed her hands on the yellowed ivory and played a simple melody. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. Just a quiet song for herself. Her mother found her there an hour later. She sat down on the bench beside her daughter, just like she had done so many times before. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They just sat together in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of everything they had survived. Years later, when Elena was performing on stages across the world, journalists would still ask her about that night at the Whitmore competition. They wanted to know what it felt like. They wanted to understand how a girl with no training and no money had beaten some of the best young pianists in the country. Elena always gave the same answer. She would smile softly, look down at her hands, and say the words that had carried her through every moment of doubt and fear. Everyone in that room expected me to fail. The judges, the other competitors, the audience, maybe even myself. But I decided that their expectations didn't get to write my story. Only I could do that. And then she would pause, her eyes distant for just a moment, remembering the girl she used to be. I didn't win because I was the best. I won because I was the most honest. And sometimes, that's all it takes.